Awesome. Well, it's great to be here with all of you. Why don't we take a moment right here and welcome everybody watching online at our microsites or wherever you're watching around the world. Let's make them feel welcome today, Manna Church. Fantastic. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh. I'm the operations pastor here, and from time to time, I fill in for Pastor Joe. He's working on some pretty exciting stuff for this summer. I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's just exciting, okay? So I'm happy to be up here for week number 2 of our series, Miraculous, okay? If you were here last week, you know that in this series, we're going through the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, there's 7 signs or miracles that Jesus does. Now, Jesus did way more than just 7. These are the ones that are highlighted in the Gospel of John. So we're going to be looking at these leading up to Easter Sunday. And what I love about this series is that we're putting Jesus right at the forefront at his life, his ministry, the miracles that he's done. And we're just getting context into what life with Jesus was like when he was here on earth. And I don't know about you guys, but when I read the Bible, sometimes I read about these miracles in the Bible and they're like short and I just kind of breeze over them and take them for granted. And in this series, what we're doing is we're just stopping, slowing down, looking at these miracles in their context, and we're focusing in on the divine power of Jesus. We're looking at the miracles that he did, and when we do this, we are reminded that Jesus wasn't just a historical figure, that he wasn't just a great teacher, but that he is the Christ, that he is the living God who opened the eyes of the blind, that healed the sick, that brought breakthrough for people. And guess what? We know that he is still doing miracles today. Come on, how many of you guys believe that he is alive and working today? So in week 1 of this series, Pastor Joe kicked us off with a great message where we studied the miracle where Jesus turned water into wine, and we learned that the path to a miracle often passes through the gate of our obedience. Come on, how many of you guys are grateful for that message? That was a great way to kick off this series. And this week, we're moving on to the second miracle in the Gospel of John, where Jesus heals an official's son. And this starts in John chapter 4, verse 46. You can open in your paper Bibles. We also have them in your notes. They're on the screen as well. But I'm going to start us off by reading these 9 verses in John chapter 4. And I want to read all of them so that you get the context of the whole story. It says, starting in verse 46, "So he," talking about Jesus, "came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made water into wine. And at Capernaum, there was an official's son who was ill. When the man heard that Jesus came from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So Jesus said to him, 'Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe.' The official said to Jesus, 'Sir, come down before my child dies.' And then in verse 50, Jesus said to him, 'Go, your son will live.' The man believed the words that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, 'Yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him.' The father knew that was the hour Jesus had said to him, 'Your son will live.' And he himself believed, and all his household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he came down from Judea to Galilee." Before we dive into this story and break it down a little bit more, I got a question for the audience. Who here likes traveling? Likes traveling. Okay, quite a few of you. If you had asked me this about 5 years ago, I probably would have raised my hand as well. But now I realize that I used to like traveling. In fact, my dad and I had a little competition going for a while of who could get the most stamps in our passport. All right, and so I liked traveling. And then I realized after a while that I liked being in a new place, and I liked coming back home. What I didn't like was the process in between. Okay, because that usually involved a really long car ride or a series of flights on airplane. And I'm not afraid of airplanes or anything like that, but I don't know what y'all's experience is, but for me, usually when I fly, that means I have to get up earlier than I normally would. I got to drive to the airport. I got to go through this security line that I have a little bit of PTSD from because my wife has made us late too many times. She's not here to defend herself. I have the mic, so I can say whatever I want. She was here at first service. I still said it. And it's a stressful process, and then you go to your flight, and you have to wait, and then you board, and then I'm a big guy, so I never really fit right, and people are always bumping into my shoulders, and I just feel dirty when I get off the plane, and then you have a layover, and you're waiting there for a while, and you eat bad food, so then you get sweaty, just me, I don't know. But I've learned over time that I like going to see new places, but I don't like the process that it takes to get there. I don't like the in-between, and this was solidified when I had kids and started flying with kids, okay? Parents in the room can relate to that. We have 4 kids, and after we flew with our 3 kids one time, we instituted a no-fly policy, which is that we're not going to fly with our kids. I'll fly with my wife. My wife will fly. We will not fly with our kids. That's just kind of where we're at, the season of life that we're in, and that happened because when we flew with our 3 kids, the one time, we were going to the beach, and I loved the beach. It was great hanging out at the beach, and I loved coming back home. I just didn't like the in-between because there was a lot of crying kids and a lot of people giving us mean looks for our crying kids. Okay, and so if you're on a plane with parents with crying kids, let me just tell you, they hate it more than you do, okay? They hate it more than you do. And there's just so much that happens in between. And you guys got to know that the in-between can make or break a trip. Am I right? No matter how much you enjoy the beach, if the process of getting there is terrible, then you're having a terrible trip. And so when I read this story for the first time, what I was drawn to was how much happened in between. How much happened in between. This man, his son was ill, and he had to travel from Capernaum, which is a city in Galilee, to this other town called Cana. And I was curious about how far these towns were apart, and scholars agreed that it's somewhere between 17 and 24 miles apart. And then I did what any good student of the Bible would do, and I went to Google Maps, okay? And I found that the for Cana, some scholars believe that might be the city that Cana was in, and it's about 17 miles as a crow flies to Capernaum, which is along the Sea of Galilee. And if you were to take it today, it's about 24 miles of road, so about a 31-minute drive. But how many of you know this official, he didn't have a car, okay? And he might have taken a donkey, but they didn't have that option on Google Maps. So I assumed he walked, okay? And if he walked, you guys following my reasoning here? Okay, all right, cool. If he walked, it would have been about an 8-hour journey to walk from Capernaum to Cana to see Jesus. That is a long journey. So it was probably at least one day's journey there to see Jesus, and then a whole nother journey back. And as I was reading this, I just kind of realized that this man's journey represents the journey of so many people. The journey to a miracle. The journey to an answered prayer. The journey to a fulfilled promise. Or maybe even the journey to Jesus himself. And so often when we read these miracle stories in the Bible, we think of them happening pretty quickly, like one after the other. And I actually wrote it down this way. Usually there's a problem, and then the miracle happens, and God supernaturally solves the problem. But how many of you know that arrow, there's a lot that happens in between? There's a lot that happens in between the promise and the fulfillment. There's a lot that happens between the need for a miracle and the miracle. And so we see this in this man's journey, but we expect almost that if we're sick, God to heal us right then and there. We expect that if we're broke, God to provide right away. That if we're stuck, we ask for immediate breakthrough. If we're hopeless, we ask that he would give us hope. We expect it to happen almost immediately. But we see in this man's journey that so much happens in between the promise and the solution. Between the ask and the answer, between the need and the miracle, so much happens in between. Because this man, it started with a problem. His son was deathly sick. He was deathly sick, and so he was desperate. He was so desperate that he journeyed 8 hours, somewhere around 8 hours, to go and see Jesus. And then finally, after that long journey, he sees Jesus. He has an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus speaks to him. And he says, "Your son will live. But this man still has an 8-hour journey home. It says that he believed Jesus' words, but it was still going to be a whole nother day before he would even hear that his son was getting better. And so often there's a lot in between what we ask for, Jesus' words, and then us seeing those words come to pass. And I think this applies to many of us. I want you to help you see what this journey looks like in your own life. Maybe you have a problem. And it's such a big problem that you're desperate and you cry out for Jesus to move on your behalf. So you go to Jesus and you seek him. And then you find him, and after meeting with him, he speaks to you. But then after he speaks to you, maybe you don't see the fruition of that request quite yet. And time still passes, and then finally you see the solution. And in this journey to a miracle, there's so much that can happen in between. There's so much that can happen in between. Fear can creep in and produce doubt. Anxiety can steal your joy. Worry can take your hope. Maybe even Satan comes and whispers lies into your head. Did God really say? Do you think he really can? Do you think he really cares? And you start to believe those lies, and they cripple you, and they hinder your entire journey because of what happens in between. Because we need to learn that what happens in between can make all the difference. It can make the difference in our life and in our relationship with God. So that in between your ask and your answer, you are full of faith and not fear. We need to learn to believe in the in-between, so that in between your desperation and your solution, you're full of expectation for what God can and will do in your life. So much of our lives happen in between. So what I want to do in this message is look at this story, to look at Jesus and to look at this official, to see how we can live our lives in a way that in the in-between, our faith is strengthened and not weakened, that our hope is built and not lost. You guys ready for that this morning? Awesome. So we'll go back to John chapter 4, verse 46. It says, "So Jesus came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made water into wine. And at Capernaum there was an official's son who was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death." What do we do in between? First and foremost, we get desperate for Jesus and we go to him. We get desperate for Jesus and we go to him. When I read this man's story, I cannot, as a father, imagine a more desperate situation. Parents, what wouldn't you do for your kids? His son was about to die. And this man had likely heard about Jesus. He maybe even heard that he had turned water into wine, that he had done this miracle. But I wonder, what had he tried first? He probably sought a doctor, sought some sort of medicine, sought help elsewhere. But then in his desperation, he is compelled to go to Jesus, to go on this 8-hour journey to find Jesus. And when I read this, I'm reminded that God so often meets people in their place of desperation. In the midst of a problem or a crisis or an impossible situation, we cry out to God, and he meets us in that place. Maybe you are in a desperate situation, or you have been in the past, where you're facing a life-threatening illness. You're experiencing financial ruin. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Maybe you find yourself hitting rock bottom due to addiction. Maybe you've been betrayed, or maybe you or your spouse has had a surprise deployment that you weren't expecting, and you're in crisis mode. Maybe you find yourself in a desperate situation like this official. And those desperate moments lead us often to cry out to God. And maybe that's why God sometimes allows for these things, because he knows they're the only thing that's going to lead us to recognize our need for him. Not to punish us, but to bring us to a place where we recognize our dependence on God. And the danger of this is we often do one of two things. We make Jesus our last resort instead of our first response. So we try everything else. We do everything in our own strength, in our own ability, and we strive and we strive and we strive, trying to fix it on our own. And then we later realize that if we just cried out to God in the first place, that if he was our first response and not our last resort, then it would have been a whole lot easier. Or at least that we wouldn't have been on this journey alone, that we would have had the God of this universe by our side, leading us through it. Or we only go to Jesus when we have a problem. And I just need you to know that you don't need to wait for a crisis to call on Jesus. You don't have to wait for a problem to put yourself in a position for a miracle. And I would even compel you and plead with you this morning to not make it a habit of just going to Jesus when there's a problem, but go to Jesus every single day to position yourself for a miracle that you don't even know you need. To position yourself in the presence of the one who loves you and cares for you and can comfort you and strengthen you, give you wisdom and hope and direction in the midst of any situation, difficult or not. I have this small group of guys, it's about 14 of us, and we're really intentional about cultivating the spiritual disciplines, about reading our Bible, praying, journaling, memorizing scripture, and we track these things to make sure we're doing them, and we hold each other accountable to do them. And I tell these guys this all the time. I say, hey, we're not doing these disciplines to make us good people. We're not doing these disciplines to earn God's love. We're doing these disciplines because these are the things that put us in a position daily to experience the grace and the mercy of God. They put us in a position to experience the miracles that we don't even know to ask for because we're going to Jesus daily. You don't have to wait for a desperate situation to become desperate for Jesus. You can make yourself desperate for him, whether your circumstances call for it or not. I love what it says in Jeremiah 29:13. God says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." And often he doesn't get our whole heart until we desperately need him. But what if we made our hearts desperate before our circumstances called for it? Instead of waiting for a bad diagnosis, instead of waiting for an unexpected bill, instead of waiting for a painful loss, instead of waiting for an overwhelming challenge, what if every single day we positioned ourselves to be strengthened by Jesus, to be encouraged by Jesus? What if we cultivated a hunger in our hearts that compelled us to go to Jesus with all of our heart every day? I think when we do that, we'll see a million little miracles that we were never expecting. A million little miracles that we never knew we needed, one after another, because he knows what we need before we even realize it. So what do we do in between? We get desperate for Jesus and we go to him. This man was desperate for Jesus, and he went 8 hours to go see him, traveled a whole day to go see him. So what do? We go to him, and then we take Jesus at his word. We take Jesus at his word. If you don't get anything from this message, my hope is that you get this. And I get this from verse 50 in this passage. I think this is the climax of the story. It says, starting in verse 50, Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." And then it says, the man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. Two very big things happen in this passage. The first one is this: Jesus spoke. And we know that Jesus is the beginning and the end, that through his words, all of this world came into creation. And the moment that Jesus spoke these words, this official son was healed. And we see that Jesus' power is not confined by his proximity. And so you may not feel close to Jesus right now, but I gotta tell you that does not limit his power in your life. That Jesus is not confined by limits like we are. That Jesus, when he speaks, miracles happen. When he speaks, people are healed. When he speaks, things that are dead come to life. There are power in the words of Jesus. And so I don't want to breeze over that, because through Jesus' word, this boy that was about to die lived. From 20 miles away, this boy lived. But there's a second thing that happened that I think we need to catch this morning. It says, the man believed the words that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. I love how the NIV says it. It says that the official took Jesus at his word. Jesus spoke, and this man believed the words that he said. Because Jesus' words weren't just an answer to his prayer. It was a promise. It was a promise that this man, this official, could hold on to, that he could believe in. And the man believed the words of Jesus. He believed the words even though he hadn't seen the fruit of his words yet. He believed the promise even though he hadn't seen the promise fulfilled yet. And I just have to believe that there was something about Jesus that led this man to believe his words. The official didn't know Jesus. He had maybe heard rumors of miracles that he had done. But it wasn't just the words that Jesus said to him. It was Jesus himself, the authority of which he said those words. That this man realized that there's something more to this guy, that I can trust these words, that I can hold fast to this promise. And maybe you find yourself exactly where this man is, where you're in need of a miracle, you're in need of healing, you're in need of breakthrough, you're in need of direction or provision for your life. Maybe even God has spoken a promise to your heart, but you haven't seen it come to pass yet. I'm telling you this morning, take Jesus at his word. Hold fast to his promise. Hold fast, believe in his words, because I think that because of these lines, that this man believed Jesus' word, I think it changed his entire journey. And I think that's one thing we need to get from this passage, is that our faith may or may not change the outcome, but it will transform our experience in between. It will change our lives in between. In the waiting, take Jesus at his word. This story reminds me of a story that's close to home for me and for many of you. There's an amazing family in the church, Pete and Kristen Gangle. They're actually my neighbors. Were my neighbors. They moved. And they're the best neighbors ever. They're from Minnesota. Any Minnesotans in here? No, a few? Okay. You're probably too nice and shy to raise your hand. Minnesotans are like the nicest people ever. Okay? And Pete and Kristen were like the best neighbors ever. And we just adore them. Many of you do. They were serving here and stuff. They're moving back here, which is great. And a couple of years ago, Kristen got a really bad diagnosis. In fact, let me make sure I get this right. It was a ductal carcinoma, but the doctor said it would easily be treated with surgery and radiation. And so there was a little bit of worry, but not too much. But then a few weeks after that, Kristen began having some back issues and pain in her ribs. One morning, it was so bad that her husband, Pete, had to rush her to the ER, and after a CT scan, it was revealed that her cancer had metastasized throughout her spine and her rib cage. The doctor suggested she consider skipping all cancer treatment and taking time just to travel the world, which Kristen and Pete took to mean that she would be dead really, really soon. Kristen said, I was assigned an oncologist who she nicknamed Dr. Doomsday. And she said, Dr. Doomsday diagnosed me with stage 4 breast cancer and a grim prognosis of living only 1 more year if I refused chemotherapy, maybe 5 if I chose to take it, along with 10 rounds of radiation and estrogen-blocking drugs. Kristen reluctantly decided to follow the conventional treatment. And after radiation, she was in pain, weak, tired, and couldn't even talk or walk around the blocks. She had tumors throughout her spine and her ribs, so much so that her ribs and her spine were actually fracturing due to the cancer. And I remember this moment because after meeting with Dr. Doomsday initially, Pete and Kristen's small group leaders called an emergency prayer meeting at Pete and Kristen's house. And And so I went over there along with a couple dozen other folks, and for about an hour, we just laid hands on Pete and Kristen and pleaded with God for a miracle. This was, I think, in the spring of 2023, and we just cried out and prayed and pleaded and said, Lord, would you do a miracle in Kristen's body? And during that time, Kristen and Pete continued to pursue Jesus, and Kristen said this. She said, I was in the battle of my life. My world was shaken. The pride that I had at being so strong and able was crushed. This was a deep valley. But I leaned into my faith, and knowing God was with me, Pete was by my side every step of the way. Friends, family, and church rallied around me with prayer and support. They were the hands and feet of Jesus. Kristen said that during that time, she felt like God was leading her a different direction than Dr. Doomsday's diagnosis. And so she renounced Dr. Doomsday's diagnosis that she would die soon and believed that God had spoke to her, that not only would she live a long life, but that she would be healed and cured. And this was 2 years ago. And in between, with all the doctor's appointments, all the treatment, trying different things, changing her diet, ups and downs, in the in-between, Kristen held fast to Jesus. And she held fast to the words that he had spoken, that she would be okay. This week, Kristen sent me this. By God's grace, my last scan shows no active tumors. This is truly a miracle. She said, God has been with me in my journey, giving me peace and comfort throughout. I reread the book, Imagine Heaven, reassuring me of my future home with him so I can always be at peace. I am thankful for the trial and the lesson learned, that I'm truly loved. My identity is that of a child of God, and in my weakness, he is strong. What powerful words. She was thankful for the trial, because she held fast to the words of Jesus. Pete held fast to the words of Jesus, and they were strengthened and not weakened in the in-between. Their faith was built and not lost in the in-between. Their hope came alive in the in-between because they took Jesus at his word. But the story for this young man, or for the official and his son, doesn't end there. There's a couple more verses. It goes on to say, and he was going down, talking about the official. His servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better. And they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour, the fever left him. The father knew that was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed, and all of his household. You see, the words that Jesus spoke to him, they came alive. They were real. And when he saw the fruit of those words, he no longer didn't just believe in the words that Jesus had said, but he believed in the one who spoke them. And he realized that he wasn't just a good teacher, that he wasn't just some miracle worker, but he believed that he was the Christ, the living God, the beginning and the end, the creator of life himself. And because of that, he walked home full of peace, full of hope, full of faith, confident, not just in Jesus' words, but in what he had done. The boy was healed. The man's faith was strengthened and transformed his life and the life of his entire family. You see, this man's journey in between was transformed because he took Jesus at his word. Pete and Kristen's journey was transformed because they took Jesus at his word. But I love what this man does. He takes the time to immediately ask, when he sees his servants, when? When was my son healed? Because he is confirming the miracle that Jesus had done. He is taking the time to give Jesus the credit and the glory for what he had done. So our last and final point, when we're talking about the in-between, we need to take a moment to look back. Take a moment to look back. When Kristen shared this story with me, she was taking a moment to look back and appreciate what God had done. When this official asked his servants when his son was healed, he was taking a moment to look back at what God had done. So often we miss the miracle by failing to look back. So when you're on the other side of your in-between, recognize and rejoice in the faithfulness of God. And I just got to ask you, when was the last time you really took a moment to look back at what God had done? To really look back on his faithfulness in your life, his provision in between, the prayers that he'd answered. Maybe you wrote down some prayers in your journal. When was the last time you looked back to see the ones that he had answered and given him credit and glory for that? Because when we look back at what God has done in the past, it builds our faith for what he can do in the future. There's power in looking back. And I've done this, and as I was preparing for this message, I just took a moment in my own life to see how God had answered prayers, to see how he had fulfilled promises, to see how he had changed my in-between by giving me words to hold on to. And as I did, I was thinking back on when my wife and I had just gotten married and we were looking for adventure, and God had given Joe this dream of starting Manna Church, Colorado Springs, and he said, Josh, you want to come start this church with me? And I'm like, yeah, let's do this. This is going to be awesome. And then a couple of months in, I kind of got a little worried. We hadn't moved yet, and there's this seed of doubt that was creeping up in my heart. And fortunately, my wife, being the person full of faith that she is, she said, no, Josh, this is what God has called us to. We're going to do it. We'll be fine. I'm like, okay, yeah, you're right. And so then we follow Joe out here and get excited about what God's going to do. And Joe's working for months getting ready for this thing. We're coming alongside and helping as much as we can. And then it comes time to launch this church that God had given Joe a dream for in his head. And it's January 21st, 2018, and there's a blizzard in Colorado Springs. And I can't imagine what Joe was thinking in this moment, but for me, I'm like, God, I moved out here for this. Like, this is supposed to work. Like, I was kind of betting a job on this thing, you know, and if this thing doesn't take off, then I'm jobless. And this blizzard is coming down, and if you've been to Pizza with the Pastor, you've heard Joe's version of the story. You get the Josh version today. I'm walking out in the parking lot, snow smacking me in the face. There's a sign that fell over because of the wind, and I'm just kind of grumbling to God under my breath, kind of angry a little bit. And Pastor Doug, he's one of the pastors on staff here, he was walking in the building, and I think he just could tell by my expression that I wasn't happy. And he said, God is good. And I said, all the time. And he said, all the time. Goes good. And I go back into the building, and it comes time for service. Joe gives us a big rally speech. Even if no one shows up, this is going to be awesome. And then, not expecting anything, look out in the parking lot and see the lot filling up, a caravan of people and cars coming in, and 420 people showed up that day, 43 people giving their lives to Jesus. And I'm like, okay, God, sorry about that. Grumbling. And now I'm looking at the fulfillment of God's faithfulness right here in you. I think back on a little over a year ago, my youngest daughter kind of had a concerning diagnosis where we thought she would have hip dysplasia, and she was a little bit behind speaking, and she was behind walking, and we were just real worried. And we cried out to God. People prayed with us, prayed for us, and now that girl's running all over the place, saying all the words. Sometimes I wish she would stop talking and stop running so much. When was the last time you looked back to see the prayers that God had answered? to see the promises that he'd fulfilled, to see the miracles that he had done. When was the last time? Look back, because when you look back on the past, it builds your faith for the future. In between, you might be in crisis right now. You might be full of fear and anxiety right now. You might be in a dark place right now, but in between, in your desperation, go to Jesus. Go to him. Cry out to him. Take him at his word. When Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, you can believe it. When he said, I will be with you always to the end of the age, you can hold fast to it. Take him at his word. And when you get to the other side of the in-between, look back and recognize the faithfulness of God in the in-between. Let me pray for you.